America Alone examines the conflict between Western and Islamic cultures. After that, you'll hear a discussion on the current Roberts Supreme Court and its impact on federalism. This event is part of the Federalist Society's National Lawyers Convention. It runs 2 hours and 20 minutes.
I want to begin with two things before introducing Mark Steyn. First, we've received news that Attorney General Mukasey has been released from the hospital, that all tests are fine. And he's back at work, so. And second, I wanted to just clarify for you, I know a number of people were uncertain about whether they were invited to the National Review reception tonight at 9 o'clock in the Chinese room. Everyone here at the convention is invited, and we hope that you'll come. It's an honor and a privilege to introduce Mark Steyn today. He is, of course, best known to this audience as the author of the best-selling book, America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It. Mr. Steyn has written 5 books and is writing on war, politics, the arts, and culture, has appeared in magazines around the world, from the Atlantic Monthly to the Australian. His column appears in the Chicago Sun-Times, the Washington Times, the Orange County Register, and other newspapers, and he also writes regularly for National Review and the New Criterion. His columns also appear overseas in the Canadian magazine Maclean's, the Jerusalem Post, and Hawke's Bay Today in New Zealand. Mr. Steyn was born in Toronto, Canada, and he lives today in New Hampshire with his wife and 3 children. Mr. Steyn is obviously a highly accomplished author and journalist, but it is his contribution in America Alone that makes him a great man. I wanted to mention 3 ways in which that book, I think, achieves greatness, because it tells the truth about aspects of modern life which we all know are important, but which almost no one has the guts to talk about. Those 3 truths are the following. First, Mr. Steyn is willing in America Alone to talk about the elemental fact that a successful society is one that produces children and replenishes itself. This is at one level self-evident, but it is a brute fact of life that modern liberal society wants to and succeeds in ignoring. The societies the left praises today are all ones where birth rates have plummeted, where populations are set to shrink in half with every passing generation. This is the case for all the societies of Western Europe, Canada, and Japan, as well as for China and Russia. Mr. Steyn shows beyond dispute that far from being a model to the rest of the world, Europe is a civilization which is in the midst of committing suicide. Second, Mr. Steyn in America Alone talks about another very uncomfortable fact, and that is that there's a strong correlation between a belief in Islam and a willingness on the part of some to commit violent terrorist atrocities. Again, this fact is self-evident, but most Westerners, including all Western leaders, seem to feel it's impolite of them to notice the connection. The fact is that the September 11th attacks, the subway bombings in Madrid and London, the beheading of Daniel Pearl, the terrorist attacks on Russian school children in Beslan, terrorist atrocities in India, attacks on Dutch filmmakers and a gay Parisian mayor, and the wave of Palestinian suicide bombings directed against Israel all have one thing in common. They were all perpetrated by radicalized Muslims. Wherever you look around the world today, you find Muslims fighting with their neighbors, whether it is attacking India, launching terrorist raids in China or Russia, conducting suicide bombings in Israel, rioting in Western Europe, or launching the September 11th attack against the United States. There may well be, and I'm sure are, many moderate Muslims around the world, and the terrorists may be besmirching the name of their religion, but the fact is that it's very hard to hear much from moderate Islam in the face of what extremists have done recently. Third and finally, Mr. Steyn in America Alone talks about the fact that Western civilization is worth defending, and that cultural suicide is to be deplored with all of our might. Many of our public leaders will not say that. The fact is that the West, led by the British and more recently by Americans, has spread liberty, democracy, and human rights all over the world. And it's the West that has ushered in an era of unparalleled prosperity and scientific advance. More than 2 centuries ago, our forefathers told the world that we're all endowed by our Creator with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government exists only with the consent of the governed. Mr. Steyn is not afraid to say that with God-given natural and inalienable rights come providential responsibilities. America is and has been a beacon of liberty, a shining city on a hill for centuries now, but its calling is to be even more than that. Like it or not, it is Americans who will decide in the next 40 years whether the West survives or whether it dies everywhere. Mr. Steyn's book shows that there can be no disengagement from the battle we are in. We must either win it or lose it. Ladies and gentlemen, it's truly an honor to introduce to you today Mr. Mark Steyn.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's nice to hear those kind words about my book. It's not always that popular. In Canada, it was the subject of, I think at last count, 3 separate human rights complaints. So I should let you know that I'm wanted for crimes against humanity in Canada, which I feel always looks good on a chap's resume. And that makes you guys all accomplices coming along to hear this. I'd like to thank the Federalist Society for asking me here, and I'd also like to send my best wishes for a swift recovery to the Attorney General. I live in the United States. I'm an immigrant. I hasten to add, I'm not an illegal immigrant. I'm the other kind, and boy, I wouldn't make that mistake again. And unlike almost everyone else here, I'm not an expert in the law, although I have been on the receiving end of it, as I mentioned just now, when the Canadian Islamic Congress brought 3 human rights suits against me over an excerpt from the book that we were just hearing about. I was accused of, quote, flagrant Islamophobia, unquote, which is a word that appears nowhere in the Canadian Criminal Code, and indeed barely existed in the English language anywhere on the planet 15 years ago. That's Islamophobia. Flagrant existed. I don't know what flagrant means when you pair it with Islamophobia. I think it just means you're Islamophobic in a vaguely camp fashion that renders it even more offensive. But it's a serious crime these days, and so they filed these charges in 3 different jurisdictions up north. As you know, double jeopardy is a no-no, but apparently triple jeopardy is just great. So I've become, perforce, very appreciative of the differences between the United States and the rest of the Western world. You may remember that business last year when Senator Larry Craig had his unfortunate run-in with the undercover cop in the Minneapolis airport men's room. Around the time that the Canadian Human Rights Commission and the Ontario Human Rights Commission and the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal began investigating my writing, I was amazed to read in a newspaper down here a story announcing that Senator Craig's lawyer had filed a brief arguing that the hand gestures the senator supposedly made under the bathroom stall divider were constitutionally protected speech under the First Amendment. What a great country. Is that lawyer in the room today? You know, in Canada, according to the Canadian Islamic Congress, freedom of speech doesn't extend to my book, but in America, Senator Craig's men's room semaphore is covered by the First Amendment. The big lesson of this is that instead of writing about radical Islam, you should just hit on imams in bathrooms. It's a lot It's a lot safer. On August the 3rd, 1914, on the eve of the Great War, Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, stood at the window of his office in the summer dusk and observed the lamps are going out all over Europe. Today, the lamps are going out on liberty all over the Western world in a more subtle and elusive and profound way. The rest of the West doesn't have a First Amendment. British Commonwealth countries have robust instruments of freedom going back to Magna Carta. Continental Europe less so, but they're supposedly supporters of things like the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Unfortunately, a lot of them have become far too comfortable with the notion that in free societies it is right and proper for the state to regulate speech. The Canadian Islamic Congress didn't dispute the accuracy of a single fact, statistic, or quotation in my book, but they said they were offended by it. And in much of the Western world, the human right not to be offended now trumps everything else. The response of the European Union Commissioner for Justice, Freedom and Security to the Danish cartoons crisis a couple of years ago was to propose a press charter that would oblige newspapers to exercise, quote, prudence on certain controversial subjects such as religions beginning with I. The response of Tony Blair's ministry to the problems of his own restive Muslim populations was to propose a sweeping law dramatically constraining free discussion of religion. At the end of her life, Oriana Fallaci was being sued in France, Italy, Switzerland and sundry other jurisdictions by groups who believed her opinions were not merely disagreeable but also criminal. Brigitte Bardot, who is a big animal rights activist these days, was prosecuted by a French court for expressing her objections to Muslim slaughtering practices. I was listening to a radio report in Europe on various of these free speech cases, and the reporter was trying to link the Brigitte Bardot case to my own problems up north, and he explained it for his listeners as follows, quote, basically Mark Steyn is the Brigitte Bardot of Canada. How sad is that? You know, I know Mademoiselle Bardot is getting a bit long in the tooth, but I thought that was uncalled for. You know, 30 years ago, if you'd held a competition to construct a form of words the English language would never, ever have any conceivable use for, Mark Steyn is the Brigitte Bardot of Canada would be pretty much a surefire winner. You know, in their innocence, my publishers here in the United States were not aware that the Canadian state no longer believes in freedom of speech. Instead, it increasingly believes in government-regulated speech, which isn't the same thing at all. In an important sense, Canada, which is one of the oldest continuous constitutional democracies on the planet, is no longer a free society. And I don't mean that there are jackboots goose-stepping through Saskatchewan or razor wire along the 49th parallel. If there were, even the most lobotomized multiculturalist drone might notice. But I do mean that in its determination to enforce a dubious government-mandated niceness, key elements of the Canadian state have taken a jackhammer to the cornerstone of a free society: freedom of expression, freedom of ideas, freedom of belief, freedom to engage in the whole messy rough and tumble of vigorous debate that distinguishes open societies from lesser, stunted, insecure ones. You know, Steve was saying earlier, there are millions of moderate Muslims. Why don't we hear from them? Why don't we speak up? Well, because the reality is that in Islamic culture, speaking up is not part of the deal. And that is why there are no vigorous intellectual challenges being made to the brute force of the most radical elements in Islam. That is why liberty is important, because eventually, if you're not allowed to say what you like, if you're not free to say what you like, then the fellow with the jackboot, the fellow who's prepared to smash your window in, the fellow who's prepared to club you over the head, is the guy who'll make all the running, because they're the only arguments that's the only form of argument that you'll wind up having. So Since I had the misfortune to become ensnared in this human rights racket they have up north, I've come to appreciate more and more the comment one fellow left on an internet post somewhere or other, where he said that he was in favor of free speech because the alternatives were, quote, just too weird. And I know what he meant after I spent a week in Vancouver attending this ludicrous show trial. I wasn't surprised, of course, by the usual Islamic scholars flown in from around the world to testify that to the, quote, overwhelming majority of Muslims, the word jihad has nothing to do with killing infidels or blowing stuff up, but is a benign concept meaning healthy lifestyle, low-fat cranberry muffin or something. But I hadn't expected to see a so-called expert witness spending a day in a Canadian courthouse earnestly testifying on the critical question of whether my jokes were not merely lame but illegal. This is Canada, where it's apparently normal now for judges to preside over trials of jokes. Immediately after wrapping up their inquisition of my gags, the genius jurists at the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal announced that for their next show trial, they would be prosecuting a Toronto stand-up comic. He appeared at a late-night comedy club and was berated by two drunken hecklers, whom he silenced with some Don Rickles-type put-down. Unfortunately for him, the hecklers were lesbians who subsequently complained that he'd deprived them of their human right to heckle. In a non-heterosexual fashion. Question, how many lesbians does it take to change a light bulb? Answer, that's not funny, but it is actionable. Old settled democratic societies do not usually prosecute jokes. I don't know whether you remember a fella called the Reverend Canaan Banana. In 1980, he became the first president of post-independence Zimbabwe. And it was said at the time that was just a little parting jest by the British government to set up the first literal banana republic. Anyway, folks in Zimbabwe found it a pretty funny name, so the Parliament passed an act making it illegal to make jokes about the Zimbabwean president's name. It didn't do him much good in the long run. A few years later, it emerged that he'd seduced his bodyguards, his chef, his gardener, several policemen and Air Force officers, and most of the guys on the Zimbabwean government soccer team. And poor old Canaan Banana found himself on trial for sodomy, and by that point, the law forbidding jokes about his name was pretty superfluous. You know, who needs gags when you've got headlines like, quote, banana forced officer to have sex? That's from The Guardian. And, quote, banana appeals against sodomy conviction, that's the BBC. And my personal favourite from the Daily Telegraph, after President Banana fled to South Africa, quote, hand over banana, Mandela told. But that's the point. It's places like Zimbabwe that criminalise jokes. And there's something very wrong when Canada and Western Europe suddenly find themselves going down the same path. You know, during my trial that week, the courthouse in Vancouver was a windowless basement. And the only link with the outside world was a clock on the wall that was stuck at 8:05. And that's an interesting glimpse into big government, into the gulf between its ambitions and its capabilities. You know, the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal regards it as an entirely feasible project to eradicate, quote, hate from society, even though hate is a human emotion that has beat in the human heart for all eternity. But they can't get someone in to restart the clock. And that is the problem with big government. How did much of the Western world reach a state of affairs where it presumes to regulate not just acts, not just speech, but human emotions? I was reminded recently of an observation by the American writer Hayward Broun, who said, everybody favors speech, free speech, in the slack moments when no axes are being ground. I think that gets it exactly backwards, because it was precisely at the moment when no axes were being ground that the West decided it could afford to forego free speech. There was a moment 30 or so years ago when it appeared as if all the great questions had been settled. There would be no more Third Reichs, no more fascist regimes, no more anti-Semitism. Advanced social democracies were heading inevitably down a one-way, sunlit avenue into the peaceable kingdom of multiculturalism. And so it seemed to a certain mindset entirely reasonable to introduce speech codes and thought crimes, essentially as a kind of mopping up operation. An illiberal notion harnessed supposedly in the cause of liberalism. A handful of neo-Nazi losers in rented rooms in basements, posting white supremacist messages on unread websites, holdout groups of homophobic fundamentalist Christians flaunting the more robust passages of Leviticus. Don't worry about it, we'll hunt down the basement losers and ensure they'll trouble you no further. Just a few recalcitrant knuckle-draggers. Don't give them a thought. And then the Muslim lobby groups figured out that if Jews and gays and others should be protected categories, why shouldn't they also enjoy the human right not to be offended? Not by no one, nowhere, no how. So now we have mutually incompatible group rights, and at that point, freedom dies. Because as in Canada and Europe, you're endowing the state with enormous power as the sole legitimate arbiter of acceptable discourse. If you point out that EU prohibitions on xenophobia or the proposed British law restricting comment on religion would be unconstitutional in America, the more thoughtful Europeans will respond ruefully that things like the First Amendment presuppose a social consensus that across the Atlantic doesn't even exist. They'll often say that it was untrammeled free speech that led to the Holocaust. Whereas, in fact, the Weimar Republic had very restrictive speech codes. There were over 200 prosecutions for anti-Semitism in the 1920s in Germany. Hitler was forbidden to speak. He was banned. There was a famous cartoon showing him as the only German on the planet who wasn't allowed to speak his mind. We know what the effect of those speech codes were. They would have been better off defeating Nazism in the cold light of vigorous, open debate. Not by attempting to bring prosecutions for hate speech and anti-Semitism. The question, I guess, is could it happen here? Steve was saying the next 40 years will determine whether America, the West survives due to America alone. I think it may be less than 40 years. I think it may be closer to 4 years. If you think of Canada as one giant college campus, its restrictions on liberty would seem entirely reasonable to many people south of the border. For example, say to a prominent politician who'd spent most of his adult life around the University of Chicago campus, say. These would not seem unusual ideas. I think there is a de facto Europeanization going on in American life. Not least by the courts. You may remember Sandra Day O'Connor saying approvingly that over time the US Supreme Court will rely increasingly on international and foreign courts in examining domestic issues. In other words, exactly the same kind of courts that are comfortable with restricting free speech and restricting liberty in the name of the broader social consensus. I don't know why anyone in this room would want to sit on a constitutional court and take any lessons from the Europeans. The US Constitution is not only older than the French, German, Italian, Greek and Spanish constitutions, it's older than all of them put together, which suggests that this member of what Justice O'Connor calls the Western tradition is a lot more traditional than our European allies. And for another, can you imagine any judge in France, Denmark or New Zealand ever taking US court decisions into account when deliberating on, say, gun ownership or capital punishment? The traffic is all one way, the Europeanization of America. And that's one reason, by the way, I love borders. The more the merrier. Town lines, county lines, state lines, national borders. They give you choices. Borders give you choices. When starry-eyed utopians speak of a world without borders, they're assuming it'll be a lot more like Sweden than Syria, and I'm not that sanguine about that. What happens when these speech codes take effect? What if it works? What if you do wind up with a society where man is freed from all the primal responsibilities of life and he's liberated from every unpleasant thought? You may recall H.G. Wells' famous novella, The Time Machine, in which a Victorian scientist builds a machine and journeys into the future and arrives to find humanity soft and pampered and passive, no longer obliged to work, no longer capable of elementary curiosity, passing the day in idle and aimless activities. H.G. Wells wrote, "It seemed to me that I had happened upon humanity upon the wane. Security sets a premium on feebleness. Security sets a premium on feebleness. In a state of physical balance and security, power, intellectual as well as physical, would be out of place." And he spoke about the purposeless energy of mankind before it settles down into perfect harmony. This has been the fate of energy insecurity. It takes to art and to eroticism, and then come languor and decay. H.G. Wells got the future exactly right, except in one respect. His character's time machine finds these passive, feeble people amusing themselves to death when it lands in the year 802,701 AD. In fact, the society he describes shows up a little earlier than scheduled, Europe in the year 2008. These are people for whom every primal responsibility is now taken care of by the state, and as a result, people simply amuse themselves in aimless activities. You can understand the demographic disaster that Steve alluded to earlier when you look at the way Europeans structure life. You stay in Germany, you stay in university till you're about 38 and take early retirement at 45. It's a grand... You have 2 months a year on the Côte d'Azur, you drink wine, you eat foie gras and truffles, you march in the street for a 28-hour work week. It's all such great fun that there's no time to have children. You thought the couple in the next street would, or the next town, or all those bucolic villages. And in the end, what do you have to show for all that increased leisure time? Where is the great cultural dynamism on the planet? Insofar as it exists, it comes from the United States. When they had to work, the Continentals produced Bach and Mozart. What they got for the last 50 years. You don't even have those bouncy French pop songs that they used to play on the radio up in Quebec anymore. They've gone. Where are Europe's men of science? They're at American universities. Meanwhile, continental governments pour fortunes into prestigious white elephants of Euro identity. When life becomes an extended picnic, says Charles Murray, with nothing of importance to do, ideas of greatness become an irritant. Such is the nature of the Europe syndrome. Liberty is the spirit of life, messy, ugly, fractious life, the energy that produces great invention and great art. And when you transform free peoples into the passive Eloy of H.G. Wells, safe, secure, societally lobotomized from mean thoughts, as they tried to do to me in British Columbia, but unfortunately one of the electrodes wasn't working and they couldn't get an electrician to come in and repair it for 3 weeks. When you do that, you change the nature of people. I don't want security, I want liberty. I don't want court-mandated sensitivity training. We need insensitivity training, because we need to have the thick skin that enables us to shrug off the perceived slights that so obsess the speech police on American college campuses, so that we are grown up enough to deal with real issues and not phantom threats. My supposedly Islamophobic book isn't really about Islam, it's about us. And the single most important line in it is a famous and profound observation by the historian Arnold Toynbee. Quote, "Civilizations die from suicide, not murder." And that is absolutely right. Here's the writer Oscar van den Boogaard from an interview with the Belgian paper De Standard. Mr. van den Boogaard is a Dutch gay humanist, which is pretty much the trifecta of Eurocool. And he was reflecting on the accelerating Islamification of the continent and concluding that the jig was up for the Europe he loved. "I am not a warrior, but who is?" he shrugged. "I've never learned to fight for my freedom. I was only good at enjoying it." Sorry, it doesn't work like that. Not for long. If you're not prepared to fight for it, you're not going to enjoy it for long. And that's the situation they're facing in Europe and in Canada, and which we may perhaps be coming to down here one day soon too. To reprise Sir Edward Grey one last time, the lamps of liberty are going out all over the world, and I think it's time we start relighting them. Thank you.
Mr. Steyn has agreed to take some questions, so if anyone in the audience has a question, please come up to the microphone here in the center aisle.
This close to the microphone, I'll ask a quick question. Isn't it true that Sir Edward Grey was seeing the street lights extinguished early in the morning, and that's what prompted his comment, not seeing them lighted in the evening? After all, this is August.
You're saying it was dawn, not dusk?
That's what I don't understood, that he'd been up all night and early in the morning they were extinguishing the street lights, and that's what prompted it.
I'll look into that. I'll look at you've humiliated the metaphor on which I hung the entire speech.
What is the status of the other two actions brought against you in Canada?
The Ontario Human Rights Commission dismissed the case on a technicality. I offered to waive the technicality. They said because the object of this is to get it up to the Supreme Court in Canada and get this law ruled unconstitutional, and the Ontario one had said, we don't have jurisdiction over a magazine. If you had printed it on a sign at a workplace, we would have. So in fact, I printed it on a sign and I delivered it to the workplace of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. The Canadian Human Rights Commission wound up dismissing the case. Essentially, these people have a 100% conviction rate on Section 13 hate speech complaints in Ottawa. Which is an amazing thing. You know, I remember Mubarak, when, as usual, a couple of elections ago, he asked the guys to fix the election. They came in and he said to them, "You've won with 97% of the vote." And he went up the wall. He said, "Are you crazy? Hold it down to 84% so I don't look like one of those ridiculous dictators. I want it to be within the realm of plausibility." Even Saddam Hussein, you know, understood you need a 98% conviction rate for your legal system to have some credibility. It's 100% in Ottawa. The only reason I escaped that is because me and my magazine went nuclear on those guys, and as a result they wound up being investigated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the House of Commons Justice Committee, and the Privacy Commissioner. I don't know whether you've seen that remarkable film Tremors, in which Kevin Bacon is battling mutated giant worms somewhere in Nevada, and there's a couple of gun nuts in that movie. Reba McEntire plays the wife of the gun nut, and these giant killer worms come into this basement where Reba McEntire and her husband have more firepower than the average European army down there. And they open up on the killer worms, and it's a horrible sight. The giant mutated killer worms are hanging all over the ceiling, all dead, blasted to bits. And at the end of it, the husband and wife gun nut turn to each other and say, "Well, they picked the wrong rec room to break into." Well, when the Canadian Human Rights Commission came after me, they picked the wrong rec room to break into.
Mr. Steyn, my name's Nate Hamilton. I'm a student at Harvard Law School. I wanted to ask you about this, what I think is a little bit of a pessimistic view of the will of the European countries to survive. At a certain point, doesn't just the human instinct to survive kick in when things get to a certain point? And haven't we even seen some inklings that Europeans are starting to resist the ever-growing nanny state? For example, in Ireland, where the voters rejected the European Constitution, and isn't there some resistance against this path that the European governments have?
Well, it's very interesting. You mentioned the Irish voters, like the French voters and the Dutch voters, rejected the European Constitution. What happened? The European leaders all get together and say, oh, well, we're not going to offer it in a referendum next time. We're just going to do it anyway. That is the European way. I don't know whether if you've ever seen this European Constitution. Monsieur Giscard d'Estaing, who some of you will remember was the President of France, had a long conversation with Monsieur Giscard about he was drafting the European Constitution. And he said to me he saw himself as Europe's Jefferson. Interestingly enough, when the US Constitution was being drafted, Jefferson was in Europe. So if Giscard is Europe's Jefferson, he should have gone to Des Moines for a couple of years. And things would have been a lot better. That constitution, he said, I bought myself. I understand there are some French representatives from Paris here in the audience. So when I do a stereotypical French accent, I'm just mocking Monsieur Giscard, who has a very exquisite Gallicoteur, rather than just making a generally racist sneer. But he goes, he goes, Monsieur Giscard goes, I was in Washington and I bought one of those little constitutions that you buy for $2 and then you put it in your pocket and everybody carries it around. And a lot of people do walk around with the US Constitution. And I said to him, that's the problem right there. You can't walk around with the European Constitution. If you put it in your pocket, you'll be walking with a limp after an hour and a half. It's all got all kinds of, it's the right to affordable housing, the right to clean water, the right to this, the right to that. It's exactly like, a metastasized version of FDR's Second Bill of Rights that President Obama apparently has such a great interest in. But the problem with that is that Monsieur Giscard said after it was rejected by the voters that the Constitution was simply too complicated to be understood by ordinary common or garden voters, and that's why they should have no say in it. And I said, I think at that time, that he'd morphed from being Europe's Jefferson into Europe's Jefferson Airplane, that, the Constitution is like just one of these psychedelic, mind-blowing lyrics. There's no point trying to figure out what it really means. And that is the difference. And so that's exactly the reason why the American system is preferable, because it's responsive to populist pressures. No matter what the Irish or the French or the Dutch do, their leaders go ahead and enact all the stuff anyway. And that's why I don't share that optimism about plucky little Ireland's rejection of their European masters. But good for them for doing it nonetheless.
Hi. Do you think the weakening of Western society that you've referred to during the speech is a direct consequence of uncontrolled third world immigration, or are they both symptoms of another problem?
I think the third world immigration is a symptom of another. And I think it's odd the way we look at immigration. I think you can look at it as a kind of cultural benefit. You live in a dreary town, you're sick of having a corned beef on rye at the diner all the time. It'd be terrific to have a Vietnamese restaurant open up. And I think it's fine if you look at it as a bonus. When you depend on it, as Canada and Europe, and to a lesser extent the United States does, then that is a structural flaw. And I mean it for the United States too. When the President says, we need people to come here, we need foreigners to come here to do the jobs Americans won't do, that is a structural flaw that is best addressed and understood as such. Instead, we candy coat it as this little fluffy bunny thing that shows how nice and multicultural we are. It's not. It is a structural weakness, but it arises primarily, I think, from the entitlement programs and from the other comforts of prosperous Western societies that have led to these collapsed birth rates. But certainly immigration, if you don't understand the dependence on immigration as a structural weakness, you're missing the central fact about it. It's not just about Vietnamese and Thai restaurants and all the rest of it.
Mark Smith, New York City chapter. I was wondering if you could talk about how the sort of movement towards Sharia-compliant financing among various financial institutions that are issuing financial products that have been, blessed by imams and the like, and all this sort of thing, and then it goes to bought often by people with petrodollars and whatnot. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this trend with Sharia-compliant financing and how that works into your overall thesis.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of what you would call essentially the Islamification of Western life. Now, let me say, compared to some of the non-Sharia compliant banks, some of these Sharia compliant ones are looking pretty good right now. I mean, there's they don't have a big subprime problem. These guys, But what it is, and it's interesting to me in Britain, for example, the number of banks who have gone Sharia compliant, essentially without being asked to, but just because they have big Middle Eastern investors. At heart, the premise is that a kind of de facto Islamic law now applies to everyone, and I think that is problematic. It also reflects the enormous investment that some of the most corrupt and squalid Middle Eastern regimes have in the Western world. I mean, essentially, the Saudis are reaching the point where they bought up everything they need to buy up. And at that point, talking honestly about Wahhabist influence and Wahhabist money becomes very difficult. I don't think it's a good idea essentially, Islam, even at its height, a millennium at the end of the last millennium, benefited from the opportunism and energy of the lands it conquered. And the same thing is going on today, that wealthy, powerful Muslims in the Middle East are investing in and buying up elements of Western life, and benefiting from the energy that created those institutions and making a very nice living off them. But once they own the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel, then those societies will be essentially a civilization in decline, because Sharia-compliant banking is not going to be the engine of the global economy. That is simply not going to happen. So in a sense, it's a sort of parasitic relationship. But I think it is a worrying trend, certainly.
Thank you. Have you looked into this whole thing with you being put on trial in Canada, looked into more of any of the real self-censorship that society is kind of going through? I mean, it's one thing if the government comes down on you, especially in this country, you have some way to redress it. But when you have even the society saying to itself, we shouldn't do this, after the Danish cartoons, yeah, even newspapers were saying, oh, they were so insensitive and we shouldn't be trying to insult people. Have you looked into the dangers of the self-censorship that's happening?
Yeah, because I think for every case like mine, there are 100 books that don't get written, that don't get published, that don't get accepted in magazines and newspapers. I would be surprised, to be honest, if, say, a Canadian newspaper would want to excerpt my book were it coming out today in the full knowledge of the huge amount of legal bills that it's been cost. I feel very sorry for friends and colleagues of mine around the world who live in other countries who at some point have to decide whether discretion is the better part of valor and start writing about something else or leave their country. I'm blessed to live in the United States. And I think it would be incredibly difficult. The statutory penalty, if I'd been found guilty in Vancouver, would be that I would be unpublishable on this or most other subjects in my own country. it's a lifetime ban. People think this is ridiculous. A pastor in Alberta who wrote a letter to his newspaper objecting to gay marriage, not in a particularly intemperate way, just essentially restating the conventional Christian position on it. He has been given a lifetime speech ban on ever saying a word on homosexuality anywhere on the planet ever again for as long as he lives. He was ordered in a thought police type way to write a letter to the local newspaper recanting. So it's exactly like, you know, Pol Pot's Cambodia. You come out of re-education camp with the glassy-eyed stare saying that all is well with the world. I'm very grateful that the United States is an exception to that rule. At the end of my trial in Vancouver, I flew back to Montreal, got in my car, and drove to the border post at Derby Line, Vermont, to go back to my home in New Hampshire. And the guy looked at my green card and he said, what was the purpose of your business in Canada? I said, I've been on trial at the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal for crimes against humanity. Secretary Chertoff will be relieved to hear that he stroked his chin thoughtfully for a moment and said, well, welcome home.
John Carpe, Calgary, Alberta.
Calgary is one of the few remaining non-insane pockets of Canada, by the way.
Thank you. The pastor you referred to, that's a case that our legal foundation is going to be involved in the next stage in March of 2009. I enjoyed your book very much. Enjoy, maybe not entirely the right word, frightening wake-up call. My question would be, do you have any specific advice for Americans or specific advice for Canadians or both as to, you know, what action items should be the highest priority to pursue to preserve freedom of speech in both countries?
Yeah, I would like the next election to be a proper two-party election, where one of the parties runs on liberty and runs on a strong commitment to liberty, runs to. My problem with what happened on November the 4th is that I've lived in a lot of countries that have tried all this stuff, and it's proved a disaster for them. And the great advantage that the United States has in particular, and Canada too, because Canada's not in the same advanced decay as the Netherlands and Belgium and Germany are. I really think it's difficult to see. I think Germany is past the point of no return. It's amazing. 40% of German female college graduates have no children. So who are the children that the Germans couldn't be bothered having? They're the Turkish Muslims. Germans don't believe that. If you, my wife's got relatives in Germany, and she was out there at their country house, and they can't quite believe this stuff they read in the papers about Germany Islamifying, because at their country place there's no Muslims on the horizon, everything seems nice. Well, if you go into Frankfurt, if you go into Hamburg, you look at the mosque construction in Germany, that is the future, that is the demographic energy. And so at some point you have to address the structural weaknesses that make you dependent on immigration. Otherwise, your country is just a zip code, and it's like Gate 27 at Reagan National Airport. It's simply whoever happens to be standing in it in any one time. But if you think that a nation is its accumulated inheritance, then that is a disaster. Simply to say it makes no difference whether the population of Germany are a lot of social democratic, childless German women, or if there are a lot of young, energetic Turkish Muslims.
Yeah.
We're having shit. Yeah,
Thank you so
last
much.
question.
Thank you so much for coming. I enjoyed your speech. I had two quick questions. The first one is, could you comment on the Organization of Islamic Conference's defamation of religion, and if they're making any progress in pushing this on European government? And the second was if you could comment on Jordan's expanded censorship laws of the internet and blasphemy and trying to extend their jurisdiction and extradite people like Garrett Wilders.
Yeah. It's interesting, the Jordanian thing is interesting. I'll just say something quickly on that. I mean, Jordan is about the least worst Arab state. Everyone loves Jordan. Larry King interviews Hashemite hotties every 3 weeks. I don't watch Larry King terribly often. It's generally when I'm in hotels here, but every time you switch it on, well, it's for the full hour, Queen Rania of Jordan, and she's looking fabulous. Totally misleading impression of Jordan. You drive around Jordan, it is a primitive tribal society that in 60 years of independence has done nothing. The Hashemites have done nothing to build any kind of genuine civil society, which is why this kind of internet censorship comes naturally to them. The OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, is the biggest single group in the United Nations, dominates the UN Human Rights Council. It is interested, in effect, in a global law putting Islam beyond criticism. They dress this up as a kind of general prohibition on saying mean things against religion. But if you look at, say, California, where the guys upset about Proposition 8 passing have been trashing Mormon churches, in Mormon temples in California, you'll still be able to trash Christianity. If any rampaging gays are in the audience and are worried about Proposition 8, the OIC will not affect you on that at all. I thought that was amazing, actually, that riot, because they were predicting riots after the election, and the idea that the one riot they had was in West Hollywood between blacks and gays, because the blacks had voted for Proposition 8 and the gays had voted against it. And the black guy, I like the quote, I think it was in the LA Times, the black guy saying to the gay guy as they were having this argument, "You're just basically Ku Klux Klansmen in Abercrombie polos." That's up there with Mark Steyn is the Bridget Bardot of Canada as one of those sentences you wouldn't think it. But the point is, that's it. It's not a pluralist thing. It's essentially a way, and there are differences in any case. Islam is an explicitly political project in a way that the Episcopal Church, despite all its obsession with gay outreach, is not an explicitly political project. And they're attempting to put essentially hedge it at an international level from beyond, put it beyond criticism. And that is why Sandra Day O'Connor is absolutely wrong in her deference to international courts, because it's highly likely that European courts will entertain the protection of Islam, and we do not want a 5-4 majority on the Supreme Court of the United States endorsing something similar because the Belgians and the Scandinavians seem to be keen on it. There's a reason why the United States has had a constitution that's lasted 230 years, and the Dutch and the French and the Germans and the Spanish and the Italians haven't. We shouldn't forget that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We're going to go ahead and begin if we could, and before